Okay, what we're going to do is take a look at elements of stories so you can start to get an idea of the components of a story and how a story is put together so that you can then go on to write your own stories. The process is pretty simple. Either a reporter thinks up his or her own story idea and suggests that to an editor, and then they may negotiate that a little bit till they come up with an agreed upon story topic, or an editor or a producer would assign a story to a reporter. Then the reporter has to go out and work on that story and gather information. We'll talk about that later in the session, in the semester. Reporting, interviewing, gathering research, and then eventually writing the story or editing the story or putting it together as a online news story. And then that story gets turned into an editor or a website producer or a broadcast producer, and then it's up to those people to decide the emphasis and how the emphasis of that story and how that story is going to be presented. Obviously, if something's front page news, that means it's a very important story. And even the layout of the front page, the upper right is usually the most important story in a newspaper, or some newspapers have a banner across the top. That's how they organize it. But you can sort of visually start to tell just by the placements of stories how important they are. Same thing with a broadcast. If a story leads off the news, then the news producers feel that that's the most important story. Something's later on or doesn't get as much time in the broadcast, it's less important. Same thing with a print story. If a story gets smaller amount of space, it's not as important. Longer space, more elements to it, then it's more important story. A lot of graphic elements go along with the story. Here you're looking at a what's called a pull quote, where they actually take a quote from the story and pull it out and use it as a graphic element. And that's when they're trying to draw readers into a story. That way, there are headlines. You're seeing a big, bold headline here, governor arrested. And then below that, a smaller headline, which is called a subhead or a summary blurb. Those are done by editors. Writers, this is not done by the reporter. Reporter just writes the story and turns that in. Other graphics you can think of, you could have maps, you could have charts, you could have little information boxes. If you're talking about online, there are all kinds of multimedia elements you can add to a story to, further tell the story, give more information. If you look at the story itself, and we're talking about print now, you have an opening. Sometimes it's just one paragraph with a reporter will sum up the most important part of the news. That's a summary lead. Or it could be a few opening paragraphs, more of a feature type opening, where the reporter will finally get to the point of the story. Quotes will be in a story. Background information, some of the reporting that the reporter had. Attribution of key information, that's key to nonfiction storytelling. Depending on if it's a light story, there may be a certain tone or writing style, if that's appropriate. And then if you're writing nonfiction, it's important that you try and balance out stories and try and be fair in the way you tell stories. Quotes are really essential to a story. They kind of liven up a story. So when you're out interviewing people, you want to try and get as many good quotes as you can and then use them in the story when it's appropriate. Here I've shown you one really kind of lively quote. This conduct would make Lincoln roll over in his grave. That was pretty high up in this story because it kind of jumps out and it's interesting. Also, reporters use quotes to kind of provide key information or attribution to story information. And so interviewing is a key part of reporting. You want stories to make sense to a reader. So part of the way a story is written, part of the way even if it's edited for broadcast or the way it's presented in an online format, it has to make sense. So maybe everyone's not following everything that's going on in the story, so they're not up to date. You have to clarify everything and organize all the information so that it makes sense. And reporters really need to stress why a story is important. And you want to keep your opinions out of the story. That's a key to all nonfiction. Headlines are tricky. A story is given a certain amount of space in a story, in a newspaper, and you have to make the headline fit into that space. So it's an art form. It's very tricky. In a few words, sometimes just 3 or 4 words, you have to sum up the entire meaning or essence of a story. And there are also headlines are trying to draw a reader into a story, make somebody want to read the story. So you're trying to draw the reader in. It's the first attempt at doing that with the headline. The subhead further works to draw people into a story, but you also have to make it fit, and you also try and capture the tone of the story. And what I mean by that is, if it's a serious story, don't write a kind of frivolous or light headline. But if it's a light type story or entertaining type story, then you will see editors try for more lighter or even funnier type headlines.